Greetings once again, Hope Lutheran Church. My video on the story of Jacob got cut off because of some incoming communications. So I'm going to continue it now with this new video. We're going to pick up the story. I believe I listed the children of Jacob, and of the fact that these children became the 12, the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's basically where we left off. There are some other stories between here and the story of Joseph, which takes up the bulk of the rest of the book of Genesis. For example, there's this incident where Jacob's daughter is raped by a local king's son. The local king tries to intervene and convince Jacob that the two young people ought to get married, and that in fact the two communities ought to join together. Jacob, this is in Shechem, okay, the hill country in Judah. Well, actually Samaria. Anyway, Jacob's agrees to this on the condition that this community they're going to join up with agrees to be circumcised. And in an interesting twist to the story, after all of the young men are circumcised and are in pain, the sons of Jacob decide to avenge the rape of their sister, and they kill all of these young men from this other community. And this, of course, bothers Jacob a great deal. But there's not a lot he can do about it at this point. His children respond to him, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?" At this point, God intervenes and tells Jacob to move to Bethel, the other ancient site where Abraham had built an altar to God when he arrived in Canaan. And while still traveling, his beloved wife Rachel has yet another son, this time Benjamin. But it's a tragic birth. Benjamin survives, Rachel does not. Rachel dies in childbirth. This is near the city of Bethlehem. So this is where Rachel's tomb is located, in Bethlehem. And so now we have yet another son involved here, two by Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. Okay, just one last little thing about the archaeological evidence. There is none relating to the patriarchs. There is no reference to any of these patriarchs in any other document other than the Bible. Like I say, the conditions that are a part of the narration of the story of the patriarchs is consistent with what was going on there at the time. There were famines, and there was traveling between Egypt and Canaan, which we'll see shortly. But in any case, Canaan at the time was an area that consisted mostly of city-state, well, completely of city-states. The oldest of all is Jericho. Jericho was excavated years ago, back in the 50s, I believe. And the archaeologist at the time was looking for the walls that fell down in the story of the conquest, when Joshua, of course, marched around the walls of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Well, unfortunately, there were no walls in Jericho at that time. However, they did find walls in Jericho, and they dated back all the way to 8000 BC. This is the oldest settlement that we know of. I believe that we know of as having taken place in this area at that time. Some other archaeologists also believe that they have found the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, although there's controversy about that. One theory is that the cities were hit by a meteor. That would have pretty much been the end of those particular cities. Another theory is that an earthquake hit. But in any case, there is also a certain amount of debate about that. Okay, let's go back to the story itself. The focus of the story now shifts to Joseph. Joseph is a young man. And just as Jacob had some flaws that he had to get over before he became a person of faith, we're going to find the same thing happening in the case of Joseph. Joseph, as a young man, is kind of, shall we say, a self-centered little boy. He thinks he's pretty important, more important than his brothers. Of course, his father aids and abets in this because, being his father's favorite, his father buys him a coat of many colors, which gives him a status as a favorite child over and above that of his brothers. But what really does it is that Joseph has dreams, okay? And in these dreams, the way he interprets them, without getting into the details, is that one day his brothers are going to serve him. Well, his brothers have absolutely no intention of serving Joseph, so this does not go over very well with them. So they decide that they are going to rid themselves of this brother who is such an irritant to them. One day, Jacob tells Joseph to go out and find his brothers who are out with the flocks. And his brothers see him coming, and one of them says, "Here comes this dreamer. Let's kill him. We'll soak his coat in the blood of a dead animal, and we'll say that he was killed by a wild animal." That way, hiding their perfidy. Well, in any case, they decide that killing him is extreme. So it just so happens that a caravan is on the way to Egypt, passes by. So they sell their brother to the caravan as a slave. So Joseph now becomes a slave, and he is on his way to Egypt, where he will be sold, I suppose, in the local slave market as a slave. Joseph is lucky when he gets there. He is purchased by the military leader of the Pharaoh, a guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar actually does not have any children of his own. And he is away a lot, which means that his wife, well, let me put it this way, she gets bored. Okay, so Joseph, however, is portrayed. It's kind of interesting. Even though Joseph goes through these events that you would think would result in a person becoming really rather depressed and hopeless, Joseph remains cheerful and close to God. Someone who remains very much aware of God's presence in his life, and someone who continues to trust in God's guidance and goodness towards him. In any case, Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. Joseph refuses, and she grabs hold of his garment, and as Joseph flees, the garment falls off, so he runs out of the house without any clothes on, and this leaves him open to the charge that he tried to rape Potiphar's wife, which, of course, she takes advantage of and accuses him of just that. This results in Joseph being thrown into prison. But again, Joseph remains cheerful, happy. You would think a guy living in a dungeon, you know, he starts out the favorite of his father's. He ends up a slave, then he ends up in prison. Now he's still a person of great faith. And two fellow prisoners ask Joseph to interpret their dreams. When they find out he knows how, he interprets their dreams, and it turns out that he gets them right. And then he is forgotten until such time as the Pharaoh himself has a dream. And the Pharaoh goes to his advisors and asks the advisors to let him know what his dream means. Well, what's the dream? Well, there's a couple of them. The main dream was that there were 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows. The 7 fat cows ate the 7 lean cows, and that was the end of that. What does the dream mean? Well, the person that Joseph had interpreted the dream for in prison remembers Joseph, and he tells the Pharaoh about him. So the Pharaoh brings Joseph up to his presence. And he says, he asks Joseph to interpret these dreams. Joseph tells the Pharaoh, well, this means that there are going to be 7 years of plenty. In other words, there are going to be 7 years when your land is going to produce a lot of grain. There is going to be 7 years when your land is going to produce almost no grain at all. And therefore, here is my advice to you. In the 7 years that you're producing a lot of grain, you tax it, and you lay aside a certain amount of grain so that you will have grain during the 7 lean years, and no one will have to starve as a result. The Pharaoh is so impressed with not only Joseph's ability to interpret his dream, but his plan of dealing with the situation of 7 years of plenty and famine, that he makes Joseph the equivalent to what we might call a prime minister or a head of state, practically, for the Pharaoh. At this point, okay, the famine eventually hits, all right? And Joseph's family is up in Canaan. And so Jacob tells his sons, look, there's a famine, we need food. I understand there's food in Egypt. Why don't you go down to Egypt and buy us some food? So down they go. Well, when they get there, Joseph recognizes this is his brothers. They do not recognize him, but he recognizes them, and they ask to buy grain, and to make a long story short, eventually Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and there is a grand reunion. He has forgiven them. There is a key phrase as a part of this whole story, which basically interprets what it means, when Joseph says, what you did, you meant for evil, but God meant it for good. In other words, your selling me as a slave was an evil act. You did it out of jealousy. You didn't do it knowing that it was going to result in something good. You did it because you were just plain jealous and you were hateful. But God was in control, and because God was in control, God knew exactly where all of this would end up. There's an interesting way that you could do an essay on the relationship between free will and God's providence in this story. every one of these characters acts according to their own free will. God does not manipulate any of them, and yet at the same time, things turn out exactly as God plans. So this notion that because God knows in advance how things are going to happen, that therefore human beings don't have free will, that philosophically is an argument that doesn't hold any water at all, at least not according to this story, because these people all act according to their own free will, and yet things turn out exactly as God has decided. Okay, so now that they're back together again, and Joseph is very close to the Pharaoh says, well, Joseph, you can invite all of your family to come back down to Egypt, and you can settle there in the land of Goshen. Well, the land of Goshen is in the Nile River Valley, Delta, I should say. It's a prime real estate for the raising of cattle and farming and so forth. And so at the end of the book of Genesis, what we have is all of Jacob's children settling in the land of Goshen. They are prosperous, and God's promise that to Abraham, that he will be the father of many descendants, is beginning to be fulfilled, because they are reproducing at an extremely rapid rate, and we have before too long 12 tribes emerge out of this situation of the children of Jacob. By the way, just to end all this, Jacob does receive a new name at one point when he is about to enter back into the promised land after fleeing from Laban. He wrestles with a stranger for the entire night until the stranger he injures his hip bone and knocks it out of joint, and he says, the stranger says to Jacob, you have to let me go. The sun is coming up here. And Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And the stranger says, well, what is your name? My name is Jacob. And the stranger says, no, your name isn't Jacob anymore. Your name is now Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. And Israel, of course, becomes the name of the people who become the descendants of Jacob, the Israelites. All right, so this ends the book of Genesis. And that means that we are now on to the book of Exodus. I'm going to introduce it here. What time are we getting to? We got enough time to do it a short little bit of the book of Exodus, at least get us started. The book of Exodus means Exodus from slavery in Egypt. Okay? What happens is that as the children of Israel multiply and become greater and greater in numbers, and new pharaohs come along, new pharaohs who know nothing of Joseph, recall nothing of him, knew nothing of him, they see the Israelites in a completely different light. Here we've got this large population of people who are not Egyptians living right in our midst. And this is not a situation that they are comfortable with. What if these people have designs on conquering the land of Egypt? What if they have designs on taking over? They're going to have to deal with these people because they see them as a threat, okay? So they enslave the children of Israel for something like 400 years. They are enslaved. And they are used to build building projects. Archaeologically, once again, we do not have any records from, and the Egyptians kept rather extensive records. We have records of a group of people called the Hyksos, and the Hyksos were Semitic peoples who, for a while, ruled in Egypt and who could very well have allowed for a person like Joseph to hold high office. So there are certain, shall we say, hints of what could have taken place at the time. But there's no direct archaeological evidence of what the Bible narrates at the time. In fact, where we are historically is that we are near the end of what people who study this sort of thing call the Bronze Age, the age when people used bronze tools, and the beginning of the early Iron Age. Okay, so it was a time when people were beginning to develop the use of iron for farming, and more importantly, of course, for weapons. They became more deadly at this time, and there was also a lot of social chaos that was going on in the population at the time in these ancient cities. There's archaeological evidence that many of them were destroyed and that new settlements were created and built. From around 1200 BC, very few records were preserved. And this lasted through a period which is now called the Dark Ages, a period that is covered by the biblical history. It lasted until the 19th century it lasts from 1200 BC through the period that the Bible actually, historical period that it was written. But what we do have at the time, and this is important because this can help us date when a people by the name of Israel actually existed. And that is something called the Merneptah Stele. A stele is a stone monument that lists all the conquests of a particular king. In this case, it was the Pharaoh Merneptah, who lists all the different peoples that he conquered at a particular time. And one of the victories listed on this Merneptah Stele created sometime between 1213 and 1203 BC. On there, it says that a group known as Israel, that their seed is no more. Now, nobody really know what this means. Maybe it means that they can't grow their crops anymore. I don't know. But whatever it may mean, Israel became the victim of the Pharaoh Merneptah in some sense. And according to this stone monument, this took place at the end of the 13th century BC. So we know that there was a group of Israelites living in Canaan in the 13th century BC. That would mean that any movement of people, Semitic peoples from Egypt, to former slaves from Egypt to the hill country of Canaan, took place sometime shortly before the end of the 13th century BC. Okay, so so we do have a little bit of archaeological evidence relating to that. Okay, but let's return to the story. The story is that because, excuse me, the story is that because the Egyptians became so nervous about the number of Israelites that lived in Egypt, that they decided that they were going to murder all of the Hebrew male babies. They were going to kill every one of them. Well, in this one particular case, what happens is that the mother wraps the baby up in a little, let's just call it a boat, okay? Puts the baby in this little boat, sticks him in the Nile River, and sends him off, hoping that maybe, just maybe, God will look out for this little baby. So off the baby goes, floating down the Nile River. The baby has a sister by the name of Miriam. Miriam is watching as the baby floats along. And don't you suppose that the first person to see this baby happens to be the princess of Egypt, the Pharaoh's daughter. She recognizes the baby to be a Hebrew baby and takes pity on the child and decides that she is going to raise this child. So she draws him up out of the Nile and she gives him a name that is based on that, drawing out. And that name is Moses. Moses means drawing out, okay? So Moses is drawn out of the Nile River, and he goes right into the court of the Pharaoh, and there he is raised as one of Pharaoh's very own sons. In our next lecture, we are going to begin to take a look in detail at the story of Moses. Just to give you a little bit of background, Moses as a person is portrayed as someone who is particularly concerned with fairness and justice. When he sees a Hebrew slave being beaten, he attacks the Egyptian who is unjustly beating the Hebrew slave. When he flees and ends up in Midian, among the Midianites, and the Midianites decide that they are going to take all the water and send the women packing without any water, what does Moses do? He steps in and he sticks up for the women. So Moses has this sense of justice, this sense of right and wrong. And obviously we're going to see that played out in a very dramatic way once we get into the Sinai Desert. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week for our trip through the Sinai Desert on the way to the Promised Land. Bye for now.